In the previous video, we talked about the different levels of hierarchy of matter that biologists study life at. Now, the study of matter itself is chemistry, and the study of chemistry has been around for a very long time, as well as the study of biology. Here I have a painting by David Teniers the Younger, around 1645 it was painted. It's called L'Alchimiste. So this is what we would call an alchemist, and alchemists are kind of chemists before chemistry was a formal science. Alchemists were interested in studying matter such that they could produce certain paramagical effects. They wanted to be able to transform lead into gold. They wanted to be able to make potions of eternal life and things like that. So they spent a lot of time developing new tools and techniques for manipulating matter in ways that they didn't fully understand because they didn't have atomic theory. They didn't have an idea of what these different chemicals they were working with were. But a lot of, you can see here, all of the equipment that he has, it kind of looks like a modern chemistry lab. So humans have been studying chemicals for a very long time. Now, before we continue our discussion of chemistry, let's talk about that word, chemical, because it's become very, very common for chemical to have a negative connotation nowadays. If you go into the supermarket, you always see little banners on the packaging that says chemical-free product. This is chemical-free water. These are chemical-free cosmetics. And some very helpful chemists put together this paper right here. This is in article section of the journal Nature, which is one of the most profound, most prolific scientific journals that exist. And they said, we understand that consumers are constantly looking for chemical-free products, so what we thought we would do as chemists is make a comprehensive list of all chemical-free products available on the market today. So here's the title and the abstract, and then it was blank for a few pages, and then they did their references at the end. And that, my friends, is what passes for humor amongst scientists. The joke is that there are no chemical-free products because everything, literally everything, is made out of chemicals. You cannot have chemical-free water because water, dihydrogen monoxide, H2O, is a chemical. So the word chemical doesn't mean anything bad. It just means it's made out of matter. So let's begin our discussion of chemistry there with that term, matter. Matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. Has mass means that you could essentially weigh it, right? Weight and mass are not the same thing, but for all intents and purposes in this class, you don't really need the distinction between the two. To occupy space essentially means that there's only a limited amount of that kind of object that you could fit into a container before it was full. So my shoes occupy space because there's only so many shoes that I could put into a box before that box was filled up. Air occupies space because there's only so much that I could put into a balloon before that balloon burst. So anything that has mass and occupies space is matter. And all matter is made out of chemicals, and all chemicals are made out of atoms, different combinations of atoms, and the different categories of atoms that we have, say carbon atoms versus oxygen atoms versus hydrogen atoms, these are referred to as different elements. So every atom belongs to one kind of element. Now that term element traces way back to antiquity. In the 5th century BC, Empedocles thought that all materials were made out of 4 roots or elements, and these were water, fire, earth, and air, which I'm sure you all already know if you've watched any fantasy movie made ever. We imagined that the world was made out of these 4 types of material, and these were the most fundamental kinds of material. So you couldn't break water down into anything smaller, you couldn't break fire down into anything smaller, and every object was made out of these 4 materials. So when you burn wood, when you start a fire with wood, it's not that there's a chemical reaction occurring that is causing that fire. It's that you're releasing the fire that was already innately in that wood out into the world. So you're seeing it for the first time. Now, this idea started to fall apart, and this is not what we currently mean when we say elements. It started to fall apart when alchemists and chemists started to notice that water, earth, and air could all be separated into even simpler substances. For example, if you take an electric current and you run it through water, you can split the water molecules into their component parts, oxygen gas and hydrogen gas. So if water can be broken down into more simple substances, it can't be an element, because element means it's the most fundamental kind of material, right? At least in this definition. And the same was true of earth and air. The air is, some percent nitrogen, it's some percent oxygen, some percent carbon dioxide. Earth is made out of all these different nutrients. Like if you get some potting soil, it has certain carbon content, certain nitrogen, certain phosphorus content, all that kind of good stuff. So when modern chemists use the term element, they're not referring to earth, air, water, fire. They are referring to the chemical elements, and some of these you're going to be familiar with. So nowadays we have substantially more than 4 elements to deal with. There are 92 naturally occurring elements on Earth, and of course, as humans are never satisfied with what nature can provide, we've gone ahead and we have produced more than a dozen additional elements using particle accelerators and that sort of thing. Just like the old definition of element, when we say element, we mean a substance that cannot be broken down into a simpler material. But I'll put a little asterisk on that. Through normal chemistry, we are now sufficiently technologically advanced that we can split atoms, break them apart, but that's not the sense that we mean this in. So when I say it can't be broken down into simpler substances, I mean through normal chemistry, not through, nuclear physics. On this slide, I have a few elements that you're probably familiar with. So gold is a kind of chemical element, and you're familiar with some of the properties of gold, probably. You know that it's yellow and that it's shiny. We say that it has a lot of luster. That's what a chemist would say, that it's shiny. But it's also a very, very good conductor of electricity, like a lot of metals are. This is why we use gold in computer circuitry a lot. If you look at a circuit board, you'll see little gold bits in there periodically. It's also very soft compared to other metals. You can hit it with a hammer and you can flatten it into whatever kind of format you want, or you can spin it into a wire. So gold is an element with very predictable properties, and those properties make it useful for various applications. Neon is an element, neon gas, and you're familiar with neon lights, right? So if you see a light with this kind of bright orange glow to it, that is neon gas inside there, and this is one of the noble gases, and we'll talk about noble gases a little bit later on. Uranium is another element. That's what we use inside of our nuclear reactors in order to get nuclear energy, in order to generate electricity through nuclear power. And if you're curious about how that process works, I suggest you take my Humans in the Environment class. But in short, one of the properties of uranium that we consider to be very valuable is that it is radioactive. It casts off gobs and gobs of energy, which we are able to capture for our own purposes. Okay, so now that we know what an element is, which elements are most important in biology? The majority of your body mass is made up of just 4 types of elements, so I'm going to talk about those. Probably the most important element to know about in biology is carbon. It's not the only one you need to live, so don't make that mistake, but it is the most important in the sense that all of those macromolecules, those big complicated biological molecules inside your cells, they're what we call carbon-based. Carbon forms the kind of skeleton of a lot of these large molecules. All of the other elements just kind of add on to the overall architecture created by many, many carbon atoms linking themselves together. So for example, proteins, and 50% of your dry weight of your body is protein. So that's a big part of what you are. They are all carbon-based materials. Your DNA is carbon-based. Your fat and your sugars, they're all carbon-based materials. So carbon is an incredibly important element to organisms, so much so that we call any chemical which contains carbon an organic compound. You may have heard of someone studying organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is the study of carbon-based molecules. Now, this comes from a long time ago in chemistry. We thought that the kinds of chemistry that you have inside living organisms was fundamentally different from the kind of chemistry you could do inside glassware and beakers and that sort of thing. So we divided compounds into organic compounds like proteins and DNA and fats, and then inorganic compounds like water and salt and that sort of thing. But eventually we got good enough at chemistry that we could synthesize a lot of these organic compounds in the lab without the assistance of a living thing. We started being able to create things like urea was the first one. It's a chemical component of urine, which is gross, but it told us something important, that there wasn't anything special about the chemistry inside of our cells, at least not at a core level. It was just a little bit more complex than the normal chemistry, but it all operated according to the same rules still. So carbon is a very important element in biology. We even call ourselves carbon-based life forms. What's next? Nitrogen. Nitrogen's a great element, very important inside of your body. It makes up 78% of our atmosphere. We think of ourselves as breathing in oxygen, but in truth, even though the oxygen's the only part of your breath that you're actually concerned about, the majority of the volume of your lungs every time you take a breath in is being filled up with nitrogen. To give you a reference for how small atoms actually are, every time you take in one breath, your lungs contain 21 with 21 zeros after it nitrogen atoms. So that is a lot of nitrogen. And interestingly, all of that nitrogen in your lungs is totally useless to you because you can't extract nitrogen through your respiratory system. You have to get it all through your food. So it is actually thanks to certain types of bacteria that are able to pull that nitrogen out of the air and put that nitrogen into the soil, which then it goes to the plants, and the plants go to the animals, etc. That's actually where all of our nitrogen comes from. How do we use it? Well, we put it into our DNA. DNA requires nitrogen. Amino acids, which make up your proteins, require nitrogen. So a lot of important materials inside of our body need at least a little bit of nitrogen in order to function properly. Next element up in our tour of the most important elements in biology is oxygen. And here I have a picture of a nice fire in a fireplace. Why do I have that there? Well, in order to burn wood, in order to combust wood, or even anything, like gasoline in your engine, say, you need to mix oxygen in there. You need a nice supply of oxygen going in. And the reason why oxygen is necessary in order to burn things is that oxygen reacts very, very vigorously with other kinds of elements. You can see that when you are burning things in a fireplace, and you can see that when material rusts. Oxidation, is the process by which, say, iron rusts gradually. It's reacting with these materials. Another place where you see an oxidation reaction releasing energy is in metabolism, in digestion. We will talk about metabolism a little bit later on in this semester. But the chemical equation for burning wood is mostly made out of sugars. So burning wood, reacting it with oxygen and releasing all of that energy to get a fire, it's basically the same chemical equation as when you burn sugars inside of your own body in order to get energy to fuel your muscles and to fuel your physiology in order to let you do your work every single day. Oxygen is important for another reason too. When combined with hydrogen atoms, we get water, and water is the majority of your body mass. You are mostly water. And the reason why water is so important is a topic we will address in its own video. Now, I said that most of your body is made up of just 4 elements, and these are carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, but there are other elements that are required to remain alive. You need to have iron in your system. You need to have calcium for your bones. You need to have potassium. You need to have zinc and iodine. All of these elements have at least some role in maintaining your homeostasis. Now, let's say I have a pair of atomic tweezers. They're capable of pulling just a single atom away from a person at a time. And every time I pull away a carbon atom, I toss it in the carbon bucket. Every time I take an oxygen atom, I toss it in the oxygen bucket. Hydrogen goes into the hydrogen bucket, and so on and so forth. I have all these different buckets, one for every kind of element that you would find inside a human body. How much would each one of those buckets weigh at the end of this process? You would find that 65% of the mass of that person was oxygen. It was in the form of oxygen atoms. That stuff you breathe in, that gas you take into your lungs, that's 65% of what you are. The next heaviest bucket would be carbon, with 18.5% of your body mass being represented. I did say you were mostly water, but the rest of what you are is mostly carbon-based compounds. Hydrogen is a very, very light element, so even though there are a lot of hydrogen atoms in your body, they don't represent a very large percentage of your body mass. So hydrogen comes in at about 9.5% of your body mass. Next up, nitrogen. Nitrogen is another one of those really important elements that we just talked about, but that's actually only about 3.3% of your body mass. Everything else is in much, much smaller amounts. So calcium is 1.5%. Your entire skeleton, that calcium is only 1.5% of your body mass, though. There's other types of material that make up the majority of your bones. Phosphorus, that's only 1%, and you'll see that phosphorus is a very important element in biology. It comes up over and over and over again. Potassium, everything after this is less than 1%. Potassium is at 0.4%, sulfur at 0.3%, sodium and chlorine at 0.2%, magnesium at 0.1%, and then you have this list of elements down here, which are referred to as trace elements. All of these on this list collectively, all of them put together, not each individually, all of them put together represent less than 0.01% of your body mass. So you might think, oh, well, they can't be that important then, right? That's a very, very tiny amount of my body mass. I can, not worry about my iodine and I'll get by just fine. But these trace materials are very important in the functions of specific types of proteins and enzymes inside your body, and all of those chemicals regulate how your body functions. So taking iodine as an example, if you lack iodine, then the function of your thyroid gland will become impaired, and that can lead to it becoming swollen, and you get what we refer to as a goiter, this kind of large lump on your neck. Goiters used to be really common just everywhere, but we started to do something in order to fix it. We started adding iodine into salt. This is why when you buy salt at the supermarket, it says iodized salt. Just trace amounts of iodine added into the salt, and then we add salt to just about everything that we eat. So in developed countries, we typically get plenty of iodine in our system, and that has virtually eliminated nutritional deficiency caused goiters in the developed world. You'll still see them popping up in a lot of less developed regions, particularly in parts of India where there is a lot of history behind the production of salt and imperialism and buying salt from other sources and that sort of thing. I won't go into it. And you still see goiters in the developed world when people have some sort of thyroid disorder. But this really did prove to be one of the cheapest, most effective public health measures that we ever implemented. That and the fluoridation of water and the distribution of vaccines. So in summary, trace elements occur in very tiny proportions in your body and yet are extremely important.